time for showing up. Once again, this is which learning standard is best for your content and how to decide. Hosted by Brian Miller, Director of Engineering at Rusty Software, and myself, Joe Donnelly. I work in the Customer Support Department. So let's get started. So, about us. Some of you might know us because you licensed one of our products and you've interacted with us that way. Others might know us as the SCORM Cloud people. I find that when we're at conferences, I always end up interacting with someone who points at me and says, "Oh, SCORM Cloud, that's you." And a lot of folks know us for that. Or you may have encountered us because you took advantage of our Ask Us Anything button. It's been on our website since the very beginning, and we do our best to answer all questions that come in. But long story short, for the last 22 years, and that is 22 years last Monday, and while I may have promised somebody no Taylor Swift references, but we are feeling 22 here at Rusty Software. But I assure you that in your wildest dreams, I will never, ever, ever make any more Taylor Swift references for the rest of this webinar, unless I do. But during those 22 years, Rusty Software has helped content providers and platforms connect via both our products and our knowledge of all of the learning standards. So I'm going to pass things over to Brian, who is going to take us through his 5 pillars of learning standards.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's just been a message go out with the chat. If you have any questions, please drop them in the QA panel. The chat function on this works a little different. It's hard to have like the whole community chatting together. I'm not sure if that's possible, but certainly we will be taking some questions. So if you have any, please drop them in, and our wonderful marketing team will be coordinating that a little bit later. So as Joe mentioned, there's this thing that I've started talking about with various people that I just have labeled the 5 pillars of learning standards. You're not going to go out, as far as I know, on the web and find like what this looks like anywhere or anybody else talking about these things in this way. But through the years, and now it is multiple years of going to various conferences, speaking at them, talking to people just off the cuff, and the question I kept getting was, I really just don't know how to compare these things. I don't know when something, provides a certain type of functionality that I may or may not need. And so what I found myself getting into this rhythm of just kind of describing what I think of as a learning standard using 5 pillars. And so we're going to go through that today. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how those pillars relate to each of kind of the primary learning standards that we see and that we support in our products. And then Joe is going to go through a number of real world use cases where, you might be able to decide amongst the various learning standards that you want to, which one is best for that use case. That's kind of the direction we're heading. So when I start talking about the 5 pillars of learning standards, I usually start out with something that's fairly straightforward and simple that most people understand. And the first pillar is package. So what does that mean? That is essentially the thing that groups content together. It is the thing that most people think of as tangible, or at least most like LMS administrators, most instructional designers. It is the tangible thing that we can pass around. We can, email it around. We can upload it to an LMS. Essentially, this is the thing that we're going to put into a learning management system. And ultimately, it is the thing that learners are going to interact with. Now, probably they're going to interact with a subset of that package, whether or not it's a SCO or an assignable unit, or maybe it's a direct launch into an application. We consider all of that content, and when we talk about content, we generally talk about the package. So moving on from the package, we get to launch, and this is kind of my second pillar. Launch is directly related to the fact that we're talking about a learning management system. We're talking about a package. So this is essentially a process, the process that brings the 2 most important parts of this transaction, the things that we know of as tangible, and i.e. a learner, a user, somebody interfacing with a learning management system who wants to experience content. They want to experience the package. They want to learn something. So it is ultimately the learner they must be launching the content, and that is how the content, the learning management system now recognizes, okay, I've started a session, I have somebody, going through and doing experience. They're probably going to be producing data. And so in e-learning, content is usually launched from an LMS. Now when we say LMS, we really mean the whole myriad of types of systems that exist out there, whether it's an LXP or whether it's an LMS or whether it's something else. Ultimately, it comes down to how do we get a learner to learning content. So moving on from that, I break this then into what's called a data model. So the third pillar is essentially we're going to capture some data. It doesn't matter which learning standard it is. It doesn't matter what that learning content is about. It doesn't matter how we get the learner to it. Ultimately, we're going to capture some data so that we can look at it later, whether or not that's for compliance or improving the instruction inside of the content based on feedback that someone's missing question 5. It doesn't matter what it is that we need to look at. If we're not capturing data, then we can't then go make an improvement, make a new learning path, get the learner to the next thing, satisfy a lawyer that someone's done their training. All of those things are wrapped up in just the concept of capturing data. So what is a data model? Well, data model is a very simple concept it just describes the format of the data that's captured. And when I say format, I mean very specifically only things like whether or not it's a JSON object, which has become very popular, one of the most popular ways of transferring data around on the web. That could be as simple as a string. For those of you that maybe use an authoring tool that does bookmarking, very often it just captures where we are in this piece of content as just a string. This is my current location. We have things like Booleans, which is just true, false. Did they pass? Yes, that's a true value. Did they complete it? No, they haven't yet. Okay, completion is now false. So very simple things like Booleans, true, false, numbers, scores, all of those types of things. But the notion of a score and completion and success, I'll get to in a minute, that's not included in data model. You don't see completion, success, score, any of that on this slide. So this is very basic raw components. This is a string. This is a JSON object. So then moving on to my next pillar is a transfer protocol. So again, we have data. Our data is in the content. That's not good enough. We have to have a way to then get that data to the LMS, to another system, to the learner, whatever it happens to be. And so that's really what we mean by a transfer protocol. And so it describes how this data is going to be transferred. So we're going to take the data model, things like strings, numbers, Booleans, and turn that into maybe it's JSON, maybe it's pointing at a URL, maybe it's a JavaScript function that gets run, maybe it's a REST web service API, and that web service API is going to allow a JSON payload to be sent across the network. Maybe it's as simple as communication from an AR/VR headset into a connected system. So it doesn't matter what it is at this point. We just know that we have data inside a piece of content, and we want to get that data somewhere else. We want to get it out to the learning management system ultimately, and then perhaps beyond that. And so that's what I mean by a transfer protocol. So our next pillar is the information model. So this rounds out our list, and we're now at 5 pillars. And the information model is the one that I've already alluded to once. And so an information model gives meaning to the elements of the data model. So I already talked about the fact that we have strings representing bookmarks. So we don't know that it's a bookmark until we ascribe it that meaning. We don't know that a true or false value in the data model actually means this person completed a content or completed a quiz or passed a quiz or got a score of 98. If we just see the number 98, and even if it's in a label, even if it has a label, maybe it's a score 98, we don't know what that information is. We don't know what the data means until we give it an information model where we can say score inside of a CMI 5 course means that they got a particular score on that exact activity. And so those are the types of things that we mean for information. So we take the data model and we ascribe meaning to it that essentially humans can understand. Systems are very good at understanding what a JSON object is, what the pieces, individual pieces, how they get put together. But for us to give it meaning, and this is where we talk about semantic interoperability. So what that data means is the information model. And as I mentioned, this is where concepts like completion or pass-fail are kept. Something like duration. We can see a duration value, but we don't know what it means depending on where it comes inside of the data model. So if we know that it's at a very high level, maybe it's talking about the duration of the entire session. If it's a duration, maybe it's a duration of how long it took someone to pass a quiz. Maybe it's a duration of how long it took someone to answer one question, one interaction. So we can have multiple types of duration, but they don't have meaning until we look at where they are captured inside based on the information model. And so those are kind of the 5 pillars. So we take those 5 pieces of kind of construction material and put them together, and we're left with a learning standard, a full learning standard. We know that we can go through the entire process. We can create a package. We can take learning content. We can give it to a learning management system. A user can interact with it via launch. Inside of that process, inside of going through the experience, they're going to capture certain data elements. Those data elements are going to be transferred to the learning management system and perhaps beyond. And then a human is going to look at that data and understand something about the experience, something about what the learner did, how well they did, what they performed, what they should do next, based on the information model providing meaning to that data. And that's kind of the way that I describe these things to people when they come up to me and they say, well, I don't understand CMI5, or I don't understand SCORM. I say, okay, well, let's break it down as the 5 pillars of a learning standard so that we can better understand that standard.
So now that we've gone through the pillars, we can actually start talking about the standards themselves. I love this slide because it really does kind of encapsulate how I talk to people. We have a lot of questions and support. We get them really pretty much every day, which is, I have an authoring tool. I have, something that's creating content. I have all these choices. What should I use? There are a variety of learning standards. All of them do specific things, and like cupcakes, Brian might not like icing, or he might not like a specific kind of icing, or a specific flavor of cake. There is probably a cupcake for you, and there's also probably a learning standard that fits the mold for you. And so, Brian, why don't you take us through some of those standards?
Sure, thanks. So LTI, we'll start here, and we kind of have some indicator up at the top of whether or not this is what I would call, pedantically, what I would call a learning standard. And so generally when people are talking about LTI, which has become a very popular standard, partially because of the number of mobile applications or the number of applications that people want to access out there on the web, they don't want to ship everything around inside of a package. LTI itself, just LTI, doesn't even have really the concept of a package. For those of you that have interacted with a tool or a platform for LTI, probably you've been given a URL and maybe a key and a secret or a password or something like that to put into the platform to launch into the tool. That's all it is. It's just a URL. There's no zip file here. There's no content to pass around. LTI doesn't really say anything about how you're supposed to capture your data. Because it doesn't really say much about how you're supposed to capture your data. There's not really any way to transfer it around, and it has very little to no information model. That doesn't mean that it's not wildly popular and that it isn't very effective at certain use cases. So it is a learning standard from an organization called One EdTech. It used to be called IMS, for those of you that have been around the community for a while. It is used in higher education a lot. And it does allow remote access to content. So this is probably LTI's bread and butter. It is the launch process. It will get a user from a learning management system or a platform into a piece of content, into a tool. Now, along with that, it's not like IMS or One EdTech is just sitting out there not understanding that they need these other 4 pieces of this puzzle. It's basically just that LTI only provides one of them. And so there is a thing called LTI Advantage, and there's a whole host of other standards or specifications from one ed tech that provide these other pieces of this puzzle. One of the things that we very often see sitting alongside of LTI is something called an assignment and grade services. It is the thing that allows you to capture scores. Newer implementations of this allow you to capture more arbitrary data, and because they have a name for that data, because it belongs in certain pieces inside of a request, then it does have an information model here. There is a defined transfer protocol for that. So we're starting to see where combining the parts of LTI Advantage gets us much closer to what we would call an off-the-shelf e-learning standard. There is some notion of security framework here inside of LTI 1.3 in particular. So LTI, the very popular version of LTI, became the LTI 1.1 version. It's really been deprecated. One Ed Tech is really pushing people to start using LTI 1.3, and from a security standpoint, from kind of a contemporary or modernization of the launch process, LTI 1.3 really does go much further, and it should be the one you're looking at if you're looking to do LTI launches. Moving on, or almost moving back to AICC, the interesting thing about AICC that I didn't realize here for a couple of years when I started working at Rustici is really it was one of the first. It was a pioneer at doing these things. Very early on was it doing things with package launch and the other elements or the other pillars here. It is generally used to track page turner content, and it can include an assessment. The package itself is a little squirrely maybe to some people who are more used to things like the SCORM model. There are 4 different types of files inside of it, making up kind of how that package looks, how you get someone into content. One of the really powerful things about AICC for a very long time was it didn't suffer from a cross-domain problem. It allowed you to remotely host content. You could launch content outside of that LMS. AICC is both kind of a standard and an organization. The organization that backed the standard is no longer in existence. All of that kind of intellectual property was shifted over and is kind of being stewarded by ADL. And so, it's not really being updated. It's not being maintained. That type of thing isn't, going to continue to progress. As it says here, the emphasis is on launch and completion. It does have a simple interactions model. The interesting thing, that I like to point out to people is when they don't realize that necessarily a lot of these community things cross boundaries, is that the CMI in the SCORM data model is actually derived from AICC. So that's an interesting kind of crossover there. So moving on to SCORM, one of our favorites, one of our longest standing members of our products is obviously SCORM. It has the widest reach, the vast majority of the adoption out there in the world, the most consistent ability for you to say, yes, I know I can take a piece of learning content and get it into the most learning management systems in front of the most learners is to use SCORM still at this point. In theory, any SCORM conformant content should play in any SCORM conformant LMS. Obviously, this is a place where the vast majority of SCORM content is still page turners. A very simple way to get basic learning content in front of someone, assess their ability to engage with that content, to have learned it or to have experienced it through the interaction model in SCORM. It captures what almost everyone really sees as the bare minimum data. You've got to have a score, you've got to have pass, fail, you've got to have completion, you need to know the time that the learner spent on these things. It's bread and butter. Stepping outside of that model tends to get difficult for SCORM, although it does have a lot of flexibility around data that it can capture. It's really more on the reporting side that it starts to have a problem where the information model breaks down a little bit. It does come in different flavors. We've mentioned the 3 most popular here, SCORM 1.2, still the widest adopted, really is showing how well it's aged, how effective it was when it was first created, because there's still so much use of it. SCORM 2004 3rd edition and 4th edition, added a whole bunch of things that added some amount of complexity, but if that's what you needed, then it really takes the bar from 1 to, I think Joe's going to talk more about it, but something as simple as the success and completion is handled a little differently. But so those are the options within the SCORM world. One of the interesting notes talked about the CMI from the AICC world. Well, for those of you that have cracked open a SCORM package that you might have gotten from an authoring tool, you'll find an IMS manifest.xml inside of it. That IMS, I've already mentioned it one other place, and so that's, again, a place where these e-learning standards kind of have melded in a way. So getting back to xAPI, the thing you'll notice at the top here is that when I'm talking about xAPI, I'm talking about something very specific, and it really only encompasses 2 of the 5 pillars. So it really is only talking about a data model, and it's really only has a transfer protocol. The concept of package, launch, and information model don't really exist in the xAPI standard, and it is now an IEEE standard. If you're used to launching an xAPI package, you're really talking about something different that we're not going to go into a lot today. But from the standpoint of the 5 pillars for xAPI, it's really only including the 2. Having said that, it does give you the ability to track anything you can capture in a JSON object made up of strings and booleans and numbers and all of the things. You can track that using xAPI. It is good for use outside of a browser. There's no dependence on a JavaScript runtime environment. It doesn't have to be launched from an LMS or a launching system. You can really do a lot of things with xAPI that don't involve those tools that had to exist. The core concept with xAPI was the ability to get data from one place to another. We need to be able to get data from a learning management system that may have rudimentary reporting, but we want to get greater insights. We want to run analytics on it. We want to get that data into another platform that may excel at things beyond introducing a learner to learning content. It's really what xAPI was designed to do. It allows you, again, correlating learning data with other business metrics. One of the big dreams of xAPI was, how do we take the concepts that a learner is learning inside of their learning content and then record data on the job of what they're doing, and put those 2 things next to each other and see whether or not the learning experience itself is actually improving someone's ability to do their job. To do that, we really want the data to kind of line up together to be able to be compared, to, again, run analytics on it. That's really the dream of xAPI. It's still a dream. I think there are still a long way to go on that, but it's really one of the things that xAPI focused in on. If you want to use an LMS, then certainly we would still advise it, but probably we're going to start talking about CMI5 there. We want to push people to CMI5. So as a segue, that makes a nice jump. So what you'll notice is CMI5 has all 5 of our pillars. So all 5 of them are represented by this specification. CMI5, the best way to think of it is the LMS plus xAPI. So CMI5 uses xAPI as the data model and transfer protocol parts of it. So if you're thinking about a recipe or you're thinking about a dependency hierarchy, to do CMI5, you have to be doing xAPI. It's not that they sit at the same level. You can't do CMI5 without it. You can't decide to capture your data your own way or to transfer your data your own way. You will be using xAPI. So that ends up being a really important distinction. That tends to be one of the first questions is people are like, well, I heard about CMI5, but I want to do xAPI. And it's like, well, you're good because you have to do xAPI with CMI5. Beyond that, essentially it provides an extra set of rules. It is on a standards path. It will be updated to use xAPI 2.0 as the IEEE standard. That work is underway. It is still intended for plug-and-play interoperability with LMS systems. Hopefully reporting is improved. One of the nice things about xAPI or CMI5 with xAPI is that there are some guardrails. There are some things you must capture, and those look very much like the key data points I talked about earlier. So completion, success, score, duration, those types of things are in CMI5 directly. And then the benefit that it has with xAPI is that you can capture literally any other data. Any other data that you can capture with xAPI, you can do it from within a CMI5 session. And so that's where the two being paired together is really the power here. One of the big things that we've been talking about recently because of some changes in the browser world is control of exit behavior. So this is a thing that one of the things that was missing from kind of the earlier notions of using xAPI was there was just kind of this, you ran something, you started capturing xAPI data. There was no real way to know when it started and when it ended. And so it's very much on the reporting tools to sit there and say, well, I don't know, I have this open session, maybe there'll be more data coming. There's no way to know those types of things. CMI5 adds in that back in that notion of exit. And then again, CMI5 is actually an ancestor of AICC. So gave one of the big talking points about AICC is you can literally launch into any type of content, any type of application, those types of things. CMI5 kept that as one of its core tenets, was that you need to have the ability to get a learner from a learning management system, a launching system, into a piece of content that may be more dynamic. It doesn't have to be living in the LMS. And so that's one of the like I said, the core tenets of CMI5 that got kept. The ability for xAPI to talk over a while, to transfer data, is really why the two go hand in hand, and why xAPI was a natural choice for the CMI5 specification when it was developed. And so it's kind of my run through. Again, I talked about the 5 pillars, how they apply to each one of the learning standards. So now, hopefully, if you think about those things in your environment, then you can start to look at how you would apply each one of these things to what you need to capture. And so I'm going to kick it back over to Joe. I spend more time talking internally. I talk at conferences. I talk about these things. I talk about them with working groups. Joe is the guy on the front lines talking to our customers about what their actual use cases are. So I'm going to let him go through the real world examples.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I really like the idea of doing this chat with Brian, just because of for that reason. We've got kind of not really two ends of the equation, but you've got Brian, who goes to the working groups, speaks at conferences, and is no pun intended, an active pillar in the e-learning community, while I am on the front row and I'm talking to people about how they're using learning standards, and if there's a different path they can take, that sort of thing. So starting with higher ed institutions, if you are delivering content there, chances are they're using one of the 4 or 5 big learning management systems / training delivery systems that are usually used by higher ed institutions. Stuff like Canvas, D2L, Blackboard, Open edX, whatnot. Most of those do support SCORM. I'm going to put that out in front. But with SCORM, you're importing packages, and then you're kind of lean on the LMS to kind of build out things. The interesting thing for higher ed institutions is the ability to create courses and that build into curriculum. So you can share large portions of data with LTI. That's where things like deep linking for LTI 1.3 comes into play, which I think is going to be my next slide. So I'm not going to lean on that too much. But whereas SCORM can give you a bunch of reporting data, it can help you in that way. It can be a little clunky to use when you're dealing with a lot of different courses and modules. LTI, while you don't get as much reporting, in the grand scheme of things, I don't think a lot of these higher ed folks really care about interactions or any of the other stuff. They're okay with a score with LTI 1.1, or a score and a status if you're using assignment and grading with LTI 1.3. But the long story short, though, if you are delivering content to a higher ed institution, talk to them first. They'll be able to tell you exactly what they need. And chances are they're using one of those tools I mentioned, and there's probably documentation out there to help you get that going. LTI 1.3, this is where when EdTech is pushing people, this is where we're pushing people, just because assignments and grades is a great service that's within there that gets you a little bit more data. Deep linking is fantastic. Just a way to connect to a tool and share a number of modules or courses all at once to be used in assignments within the platform. It's great. And candidly, the first time that I was able to deep link from a tool into one of our tools, I got kind of excited because it was great. I got a nice little page. It showed me all the things that I was sharing or was connecting to, and I was able to hit the ground running. That sort of thing really pushes LTI 1.3 past 1.1 as really the standard of choice for LTI. And this is one that a lot of folks, you associate it with higher ed. However, I've kind of noticed that we do have some folks in the corporate space that are kind of dipping their toes into this pool. It's not a ton yet, mainly due to it doesn't have quite the data model that the other standards have, but it is quite efficient in what it does. All right, so what if you have traditional page turner courses, something out of an authoring tool, or maybe you built it yourself? What standard should you be using? Really, in the grand scheme of things, I can make a argument for pretty much any of them. But what you will probably see, the SCORMs, SCORM 1.2, SCORM 2004, any of the editions, you'll start to see CMI 5. We see that a lot more now, just because, like Brian was saying, you can get that data that you could get out of SCORM. So you could have SCORM parity, but then you can take a step further and get some better data that you can really kind of dig into the analytics of your courses and what your learners are experiencing. It's not on here, but AICC, same. AICC could give you your page turners. It can report on most of the data that 1.2 does, so it can get you there as well. So really the answer here is pretty much any of the standards could get you here. And if you're just looking for the big four, which is success status, completion status, score, and time, then any of these will get you there. So video, really, I think of this as you can have a video that you can import possibly into your LMS and play it, or you can have a video within a course, or a video within a module or SCO, or with respect to a video within a module, a SCO, an AU, anything like that, really any of the standards will be fine. It really depends upon what kind of data or what kind of behavior you're expecting out of that video. So if you're expecting maybe the video to bookmark or not quite talk, but maybe be communicative, then if you have a video within a course, chances are, unless it does something really cute, it's not gonna get the data that you're looking for. In that case, maybe your LMS can import media files or something like that, and they are doing something extra. But for a page turner course that has video assets within it, then yeah, you're free to use any of those standards, and they should work for you. All right, one of my favorite things to talk about is SCORM. Everybody knows that, right, Brian? But SCORM 1.2, its ubiquity is its strength. It's everywhere. If you need to publish something that you want to reach as many LMSs as you can, chances are SCORM 1.2 is the answer. Yes, it doesn't have all of the data that SCORM 2004 does. However, kind of like baking a cupcake. First time you bake a cupcake, it's not going to be perfect, probably. I know in my experience, I am an amateur baker and I'm not really great at it, but you practice and it gets better. There are so many implementations of SCORM 1.2 out there. It's baked a lot of cupcakes. And so because of that, if you are looking to create a course that has the big four in it, maybe does some light interactions, but we'll talk about that in a minute, then SCORM 1.2 should do the job for you. Okay, so cross-domain, Brian touched on this. and I'll kind of add a spin. One, as he said, AICC handled cross-domain or like remote launch natively. So if I see an AICC course out in the wild, chances are it's cross-domain. That's why we have it. I don't see a lot of LMS hosted AICC content anymore. There may be some stuff out there still floating about, but because the standard's been deprecated, we don't see as much. Nobody's making really. I don't see a bunch of new AICC content. On top of that, there are tools out there that allow you to kind of break free of the cross-domain problem that SCORM has. So there are ways around that now that we didn't have back in the day. CMI5's on this slide, but it's a little bit different. CMI5 is more so a way for you to hit remotely hosted content from things like a mobile app, your AR, VR devices, things of that nature. We're going to talk a little bit about AR, VR here in a little bit. So while it's not really like cross-domain browser communication per se, it's just a way that you can put your CMI5 package somewhere and then remotely link to it from your system, your app, your LMS, things of that nature. So back in the old days with AICC and SCORM 1.2, there was one status, and it was called lesson status. And a course, SCO, AU would pipe the status into that one element. And there are several values that you can put through that element, things like completed, passed, failed, incomplete, unknown, those sorts of things. And so if you wanted to say something was completed and passed, you'd have to kind of do some trickery to get those statuses pushed across in a way that an LMS is going to understand it, because once again, there's just that one status. SCORM 2004 changed that, and it split the status into completion status, which is did I get to the end of the course, and then success status. If there's an assessment or a quiz, did I pass or fail it? So with SCORM 2004 and the modern learning standards, CMI5 and xAPI, you have an opportunity to weigh both of those things instead of just making the assumption that says, if I send passed, they're also completed, because they might not have technically completed the course. They may have taken a pretest. They may have done any sorts of things. And so the split of status happened in 2004 and moving forward, and gives you a little bit more flexibility into how you are communicating status to your LMS, LRS, however you're communicating that data. So this is, I think I talk about interactions or full question and answer text literally every day of my life. I will answer at least one question a day, if not multiple, because quiz reporting, interaction reporting is something people love to see. If you have an assessment and you want to track how people are taking certain questions, are they getting it right? Are they getting it wrong? You can go as granular as how long are they taking on this particular interaction? There's a latency element in there that you can you can use in SCORM 2004, actually in 1.2 as well, I think, that you can gauge that. So in SCORM 1.2 and AICC, limited interactions. So we're talking IDs. So you've got a question, ID 1, I answered B, or I answered whatever that identifier is. You're not going to get why is the sky blue, answer because. You're going to get just whatever the, I guess, enumeration for the question and answer is. In some cases, that just works, and that's fine, because you might create those quizzes and assessments yourself. You might know what question 1 is. You might know what, answer 1C is. But if you don't, SCORM 2004 came in with a more robust interactions model that includes a description, which is the question text. It includes an answer, which could be the entire answer. Now, they could also use enumerations as well, but you have that option in SCORM 2004. And along with 2004, all editions, xAPI and CMI5 offer the same. You can send that data across to your LRS to be reported on somehow, however you're doing that. But all of these standards here on the page, they are going to get you there if you want your full question and answer text reporting. Moodle, super popular. Moodle is an open source LMS that we talk about all the time. It's super easy to use. However, it natively will only support two standards, SCORM 1.2 and LTI. So if you are a content author, content creator, you own a library of content, and you want to deliver that content to somebody using Moodle, these are your options. SCORM 1.2, or if you can act as a tool, you can have them connect the platform, their Moodle platform, to your tool to share content that way. The LTI setup is very easy and really quick to understand and get moving. But at the same time, SCORM is pretty easy too. A lot of the times it's just click upload, grab your zip file, pop it up there, and you're good to go. So this is really because we do talk to Moodle users quite a bit. Just a thing to throw out there, mostly for content folks, to say, hey, if you got SCORM 2004, you're either going to need to find a way to republish that or find a way to translate that communication so that it can be SCORM 1.2, well, really, that's your option. The ability to track data, you're thinking outside the bun here. So the big four is great. Interactions reporting is great. But what if I wanted to report on something like, where did a learner click on a certain slide? Did they open a PDF? How long did they spend on a slide? Things that might not be within the standard, information model for any of the learning standards. This is where xAPI and CMI5 shines, because it's not really, at least xAPI is not really going to govern like what you say, it's how you say it. And so while you're not kind of shackled down by the spec that says you must do this in this way, you are kind of free. It's kind of like the Wild Wild West. CMI5, I like quite a bit because you are on rails, like Brian was saying. There are certain things you must do, but then also you can do the cool stuff that xAPI does. If you have an app that you want to measure certain things that fall outside of things like completion status and score, you can be looking at those types of data and populate an LRS and have a great set of analytics for your courses or application that uses these standards. So AR/VR, we talk about this some. We have folks that come in and talk about it. I think we kind of touched on this earlier. xAPI, CMI5, these are really the standards that will help if you are into these types of things or serious games. Once again, because you're able to kind of think outside of the spec as far as I have to say, X, Y, and Z, you can be more creative with what your learners are experiencing and how to push them to the learning record store. Now, that's not to say you can't use SCORM, or you can. I've seen it done, but you are kind of shackled down. And with these other standards, like we were talking about on the last slide, you are free to report on data that you didn't need to do, we weren't able to do before. And on top of that, with CMI5, and you are able to remotely launch into things. So the idea of being able to report on data you couldn't before, and then the remote launch aspect of it, really makes these two standards shine in this scenario. How am I doing? Did I make it? That was that last one?
Yeah, you did.
I did it. Okay. Well, Brian, you wanna do our outro
Sure, I
or
can.
talk to questions?
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly take some. I think I was trying to see if I could find the list of what may have come in. But as
Mhm.
Joe said kind of at the beginning, this is the stuff we talk about all the time. I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say that it's super exciting. But if you do have questions about it, if you're running into a problems with your authoring tool, just getting started, figuring out where something aligns with your ecosystem, you're handed, maybe you take on a new position and you're handed, oh well, we have a course library of 5,000 courses, and all of them are SCORM 1.2, and I'd really like to do some little bit more intricate things. Then ask us, talk to us about this stuff. We may have a path forward for you. We may have suggestions. uh, Frankly, sometimes we just say, hey, let it ride. Start working on the next course that you're going to build, and do something new and cool with it. um, there's any number of approaches here. As Joe kind of said, he's seen it all. uh, I won't say that just because Joe's seen it that you should do it. I think he would agree. But there is definitely a path here. Um, One of the things that I've heard us described as e-learning therapists. Even if you just want to have, come in with a comment of, I can't stand completion. I can't stand the interaction model. I can't stand the fact that I can only see, question 1C. Then we're here for that, and we'd like to help you come up with a better way to do the things. I spend at least an hour a week, often more than that, talking to folks from the working groups about how do we make these things better. What goes in the next version of CMI 5 so that it becomes so compelling that this kind of standard out there that's been around for 25 years is not everyone's go-to. Not that it can't be, but we have those conversations. We talk to LMS vendors all the time. We talk to content developers all the time. We talk to, there's a whole new spate of people who are working on something called learning engineering. We're involved in that community. We talk to the Department of Defense about their projections. The thing that I've noticed about the Department of Defense versus the corporate world is, corporate world is thinking 2 quarters ahead, maybe. The Department of Defense is thinking 30 years ahead. They have a massive population, and they see, they have this whole notion of lifelong learning, because they're having people, service members, enter at, maybe they're entering at 18 and they're hanging around for a while, and then they're going into the career outside of that. So they see this whole process, so they're thinking about the things that are necessary to capture the notion of lifelong learning. Along with that, they have service members who deal with something, as their job for the service, but they, maybe they have a job outside of it, and maybe they have skills, or their employees have skills that they use outside of their service work, and so they're always looking at skills and competencies and all of the next things to determine that, and we're looking to stay, inside of that same group. So in the future, just like One Ed Tech has LTI, and then they have a whole bunch of standards that sit along that. There are others of those coming for this space here that will leverage the type of data that you can get out of xAPI, where we can start to look at, okay, when we hired this person, what their skill set was, what they've done, while they're with us, and maybe they're leaving. What skills did they learn that allowed them to go on to their next role? What should we be looking at? All of those kinds of types of things come from leveraging e-learning standards and interoperability of data to set us up for what we want to see in the future.
Looks like we've got some questions too, Brian.
Cool,
We
go
can
for it, Joe.
have after. So Jeff asks, seems that LTI is used primarily in higher ed, but could have value in corporate learning as well to easily consolidate content into a single platform for learners. However, I've seen that many LMS vendors and content providers don't offer it. Is there any specific reason it's not more widely adopted outside of higher ed? Um, you want me to jump in?
I don't think
I can give
so.
you
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a specific reason other than, possibly when you get accustomed to a certain level of reporting that LTI doesn't provide. From an efficiency standpoint, I mean, your question kind of hit the nail on the head, is that it's pretty cool in that manner, but it does offer limited reporting. And if you're accustomed to getting interaction data or any of the kind of extra things, then you're kind of missing out.
Yeah, I think some of it's just historical, political things, you know, like, you know, the other thing that we see very often with higher ed, not only were they contributing to the organization, contributing to what was IMS and now One Ed Tech, so they wanted to use the thing that they were having their folks contribute to. The other thing is in higher ed, there's kind of this very defined path of, you know, like Joe was talking about earlier about courses, and a course for higher ed is a semester long engagement for a learner with a set of material that probably is pre-existing or doesn't change a ton, you know, those types of things. So it's more about that progression and frankly the, you know, 3 to 5 year engagement with a learner, and then that's it. Now higher ed I think is moving to this place where they're doing a better job of anticipating students coming in and students leaving, but for a long time I think it was very much a, they're here now, what can we do, how do we facilitate that the best. So there's a wide range of things that go along with it, that all of, if you put all of them together, then you get this really powerful system. LTI is really just this one teeny tiny little chunk, but that's where it's like, that's the chunk that corporate America is most interested in, because it is, how do I get my learner to launch into this other thing, an application or whatever it happens to be. They're less concerned about something like QTI, which is this very large standard about how you give assessments and how you capture interactions. And you know, there's a large pile of work that goes along with just doing QTI, that what we see in the corporate stuff, particularly in compliance, it's just not as meaningful to them, because, you know, very often you have one course or a set of courses that are all authored by the same people, they're the same, you know, the same format, but then other content could be different. Whereas for a course for higher ed, it's got to look very similar. So that's where all of those other standards apply that may or may not matter to the corporate world.
Thanks, Brian. Jamie wants to know, does CMI5 require an LRS like xAPI, or can it be plugged directly into an LMS?
So this is a weird kind of thing. This is where I go back to the dependency thing. So yes, you must have an LRS because CMI5 must be using xAPI. So as soon as you launch up a piece of content, the very first thing that content is going to do is going to send an xAPI statement that says that it's initialized. And then you can go through and do all your content things, and then maybe you have a quiz or whatever, and you're going to send a statement that is passed. That is how you capture data in CMI5. You must use xAPI. To capture xAPI data, you must have an LRS. Now, the way we tend to talk about these things is actually an LMS, LRS kind of integration. Anybody that's going to provide CMI5 support, they're going to have what we would refer to as a player, is going to provide that LRS alongside of the player. And so really, if you go out there and you say, can I play CMI5 content in your system? And the response from that LMS, LXP, whatever it is yes, then they are going to have figured out that problem. They're going to provide an LRS. For instance, our Rusticy engine product has an LRS built inside of it, and the player, it's all one thing. And so when you go to import a CMI5 course, it handles that part. When you go to launch that CMI5, it's called an assignable unit AU, it's going to have that piece. And in that is going to be the instructions of how to talk to the LRS inside of Engine. That's already done for you. So the key takeaway there is, if you're producing CMI5 content, you want to start using it from an application or whatever, look for a CMI5 player. You don't have to worry about the LRS part of it.
I'm going to put the next two questions together because they're somewhat related. Scott asks, curious if you have any metrics about the adoptions of different standards. And Jim says, could you estimate market share for CMI5 and its expected growth rate? But you might find that second one interesting, Brian.
Sure. I don't know that we have any of those things. We do have it's still out there, and I'm not sure it's updated. We have a stats page that we use. We pull the data from our SaaS platform, our SCORM Cloud, and we kind of think of it as kind of a general industry look, just because there are so many customers, there are so many different users in a lot of different industries using that platform that we feel like we can get kind of a feel for what's being done out there in the world. To be frank, SCORM 1.2 is still a massive leader there. And I think years ago it would have been like, well, of course it is because it's SCORM Cloud and because that's what everybody had when it started. The fact that CMI 5 may be new to a lot of you, but it's been out for 8 years. xAPI, really, you want to look at maybe the start of it as 10 years ago, all of these things. AICC is the oldest. So it becomes like, if it's just a time thing, then why isn't AICC the most popular, right? And so that's what we see is that SCORM 1.2 is by far, in a way, the leading standard, at least on SCORM Cloud. Now, some of it could be that it's called SCORM Cloud, but again, we tend to push it in all the ways that we push all of the learning standards. So I don't think so anymore. As far as CMI5 adoption and the curve, to be quite frank, we're somewhat disappointed that it hasn't taken off more, but we are starting to see, it show up in a lot more places where we wouldn't have necessarily seen it before, even in the last couple of years. We ran a whole project with ADL that provides for conformance testing. We did a lot of work on really nailing down the requirements in the specification. There's tools out there. There's an open source player. Some people are starting to look at implementing it or integrating it with Moodle. I know the DoD and ADL have done work in that front. So it's one of those things where we're starting to see kind of momentum build, and I think it's a thing that will continue to increase over the longer term. As people start wanting to capture more data, as more systems are available to provide the types of analytics that you need to have in place to then get value out of that. And that's the thing that we're looking at now is we're beyond the early adoption stage. We're beyond those types of things. People are looking at what is the value I can get from this? And that's where the extended data capture becomes interesting for putting it back into development of the instruction, side of things so that the instruction can get better, so that we can start putting this next to on the job data. Those types of things will start to become possible.
We got a handful more. See if we can get through them before the top of the hour, which I realize is really close. But Rachel asks, are there standards that are better suited for an e-learning complex branching scenario? It really depends. I could probably make an argument for a lot of learning standards if it's a single SCO course. So if the branching is happening within one SCO, like if you have, you're using an authoring tool and you can build out that branching scenario within that tool and export it as a single SCO, then really I'd probably push you towards SCORM. If it was multi-SCO, then I would probably go SCORM 2004. We've got some interesting samples. I think we have a branching sample, or a very simple branching sample, on www.scorm.com under the resources area. There's a bunch of golf courses, and one of them does some pretty neat stuff that might be helpful. But if you have questions like that, also feel free to reach out. Alicia, what's up, Alicia? Do you recommend using one standard across your entire library, or could it be useful to use SCORM for standard linear courses and xAPI and CMI5 for complex courses like scenarios and simulations? I think that I would probably use the standard that makes most sense for really not only the content you're delivering, but your workflow. If you have the ability to export SCORM for some things and xAPI and CMI5 for others, then and that makes sense, as far as what you're trying to report, then I think it's okay to do kind of onesie twosies depending upon what the course is. Brian, do you have any comments on that one?
I mean, there's a certain benefit to just going to all in one, but yeah, I don't know that there's a rush to make it so. And that would be my comment would be, if you have a course library, then don't rush to convert it over. We actually have some material on this. I'm pretty sure it's on the website. We did a poster session and it talked about the value added to changing standards or migrating to CMI5, for instance. And it's, what is the impact of this course? How many learners does it get in front of? How often does it change? If you're already updating something, consider moving to a new standard. If you have a course that is, you know, that doesn't need to change. Maybe it's about how to do maintenance of a vehicle that is no longer being sold. So, and maybe there just aren't that many people that are training up on that. Then it becomes, almost a why bother? Like let's not worry about that. And so yes, I think it's okay to have those things sitting next to each other. It probably also has as much to do with the other systems that are here. So if you have an LMS and you're most concerned about completion, then it probably doesn't matter. If you're trying to drive a whole new analytics platform and it needs really robust data, then you're probably going to need to move from SCORM 1.2 or whatever it is to something that's more contemporary.
Thanks, Brian. Scott asks, or he says, I'm struggling to find an LMS outside of SCORM Cloud that provides an LRS and or provides simple reporting for xAPI content. Hopefully CMI5 will be a better industry adoption. We'd love to see some of the more advanced features. Yeah, I think you're probably going to be seeing that, seeing a lot more when it comes to CMI5. CMI5, as Brian was saying, I kind of look at that as xAPI for LMS folk, because for xAPI it really wasn't needed, but now it kind of brings xAPI back into the fold for us all using LMSs. The struggling to find an LMS that has an LRS is that's a tough one. I know there's a lot of players out in the world that have the LRS built in, like the ones that use our engine. But what I would do is when you're engaging these people, just make sure you ask ahead of time. And then I wanted to mention this one because Ignacio asked a good question. Where can I find simple CMI5 example packages? And is there an open source LMS where we can test them? Brian, would you like that one?
I don't know of an open LMS or an open source LMS where you can test them. There is an open source player where you can test them. You can test them in our SCORM Cloud product. And there is sample content out there as part of what we call Project Catapult. If you go on the web and search for Project Catapult, I'm sure you'll find it. It's an ADL stewarded resource. And it was the thing that I mentioned earlier around conformance testing, those types of things. There is sample content out there that shows you typical page turner, how to do assessments with interaction capture. There is video that shows you how to capture data that's related to playing and pausing and those types of things for a video. So, yeah, Alicia just put a link for that, Project Catapult. So that's definitely the place to look. Getting back to the prior question, the one comment I would say is, and we tell this to everybody, is if you're interested in this support, the thing that we have heard the most from LMS vendors and authoring tools is that they just don't hear the need for this. So they're not, as Joe mentioned, any of our customers that has a Rustici engine version from the last 8 years has CMI5 support in it. They may not have exposed it. They may not know that it's there. They may not be ready to support it. But what they're waiting for is to hear from customers, potential customers. So if you're asking that, then and you're pushing on them to research, are you backed by Rustici products? Then you should check to see, like that's a conversation you can have that will prompt them to maybe go and look. Oh, we do actually have support for this. I think we're probably coming up in time. We're a little over.
We've got two more though. I think we can finish if
we can do it.
We got two more. So Cassandra, is there a quick reference chart / resource you can share that breaks down the differences between what each type of file can report? I think we have something like that on the site. And what we can do is we can email that to you afterwards. Since we have your email, we'll send it to you. I think there's a page that we've used in actually some of our other webinars that could be helpful there. And then Pierre asks, which standard allows for content update through an API? What do you think about that, Brian?
Content update. If you mean like actually updating the assets, then none of them that I know of. There is this thing out there in the world called pins, and there may be some people here that are not happy that I mention it, but pins is a thing that exists. I think more often what we're seeing these days is rather than doing the old style package where now you have this problem of assets are out of date, people are preferring to do the remotely hosted launch. So it's CMI5 AICC where you're just hosting that asset and you're launching to it, and so now it's fully within your control. The shameless plug here is we have a product called Content Controller that can actually assist with this, where you're using standard e-learning content, you can centralize it all in one location, share out packages that can be launched into that location. So that's another way to do it. I won't go so far as to say that it's an LCMS. Those exist too, but it actually sits in between. So if you don't want to go full LCMS, you don't want to have to put all of your content in that location, then that can be a nice solution. But none of the standards we're talking about today have a defined way to update assets, for instance.
All right. Well, we did it. We got through all the questions. Y'all, thank you so much for your time, and for those of you that spent some time afterwards. We really appreciate you hanging out with us. In the future, if you have any questions, please feel free to message us. I am behind the support@rustsoftware.com address along with my team. If you have a client success manager and you're already a customer, if you have any questions, you could always hit them up as well. But we really appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks.